The ER doors blew open, but it was not an ambulance. 4 Marine helicopters had just touched down in the civilian parking lot, their deafening rotor wash shattering the lobby windows. Heavily armed soldiers stormed the triage desk, ignoring the screaming chief surgeon. They had one demand. "Where is Angel 6? The fluorescent lights of Pine Ridge Regional Hospital flickered, casting a sickly, sterile glow over the chaotic emergency room. It was the kind of night where the city's underbelly bled into the pristine white hallways of the trauma center. Amidst the frantic symphony of heart monitors, shouting paramedics, and weeping families, Morgan Jenkins moved with a rhythmic, inescapable sound. Thump, drag, thump, drag. Morgan was 34, but the deep, exhausted lines around her hazel eyes made her look a decade older. Her uniform was standard issue, yet beneath the scrubs on her left leg was a massive, articulated titanium and carbon fiber brace. It locked her knee and severely restricted her ankle, a permanent reminder of a day she never spoke about. To the staff at Pine Ridge, Morgan was just the quiet, painfully slow nurse who managed the supply closets and handled the discharge paperwork. She was a fixture of pity, the broken bird of the ward. Dr. Elliot Sterling, the hospital's chief of surgery, practically owned the trauma bay. Tall, impeccably groomed even hours into a shift, and reeking of expensive cologne and arrogance, Sterling viewed the emergency room as his personal stage. And on his stage, Morgan was an unwanted prop. "Jenkins!" Sterling's voice cracked like a whip across the nurse's station. "Why are these IV bags not restocked in Bay 3? I have a ruptured spleen coming in any moment, and I am not waiting on a supply clerk to fetch my saline." Morgan did not flinch. She slowly turned, her face a mask of absolute neutrality. "The bags are stocked, Dr. Sterling. I placed them in the secondary warmer because the primary unit has a faulty thermostat. If you use the primary, you'll be pushing cold fluids into a patient in hypovolemic shock." Sterling's jaw tightened. He hated being corrected, especially by a nurse and especially by her. "I don't pay you to play doctor, Jenkins. I barely pay you to walk. Go to the basement and audit the surgical gauze. Stay out of the way. Tonight is going to be hell, and I can't afford to have a liability limping around my trauma bays." Head nurse Sheila Carmichael, a woman who had made a career out of shadowing Sterling's ego, stepped in, placing a condescending hand on Morgan's shoulder. "Come on, Morgan. You know you can't keep up with the adrenaline hits? Just go to the back. It's safer for everyone." Morgan looked at Sheila's perfectly manicured hand on her shoulder. A flash of memory struck her. Dust, the smell of cordite, the deafening roar of a heavy machine gun, blood slicking her hands as she packed a shattered femoral artery. She blinked it away. Her heart rate had not even elevated. "Understood," Morgan said softly. She turned, her brace emitting its familiar mechanical click, and began the long walk toward the supply elevator. Thump, drag, thump, drag. She was halfway down the corridor when the hospital's disaster klaxon began to wail. It was not the standard two-tone chime for an incoming trauma. It was the continuous blaring siren of a mass casualty incident. The hospital radios erupted. A catastrophic structural collapse had just occurred at the old ironworks facility miles out of town. Worse, it had happened directly beneath the low-altitude flight path of nearby Camp Henderson. A military transport convoy moving hazardous ordnance on the ground had been caught in the crossfire of the collapsing infrastructure. There were dozens of civilian casualties, but the radio chatter was dominated by something else, frantic, scrambled military frequencies bleeding over the police scanners. Within minutes, Pine Ridge Regional descended into absolute madness. The doors blew open again and again, paramedics wheeling in crushed, bleeding, and suffocating victims. The waiting room became a triage battlefield. Dr. Sterling was shouting orders, his previous immaculate composure unraveling as he faced severe crush injuries and traumatic amputations, injuries he usually only read about in textbooks. Morgan stood at the threshold of the supply room. Her instincts, forged in the fires of places not on any map, screamed at her to move forward. She grabbed a specialized trauma kit she kept hidden in the back, packed not with standard civilian gear but with combat-grade tourniquets, hemostatic agents, and chest seals. She limped rapidly toward Trauma Bay 1, where Sterling was furiously trying to stop the bleeding of a factory worker with a pulverized leg. The man was crashing. "Clamp! Give me a damn clamp!" Sterling screamed, his hands slick with blood. "He's bleeding out! Where is the suction?" Morgan pushed through the crowd of panicked residents. "His femoral is retracted," she said, her voice cutting through the panic with chilling, icy authority. "A clamp won't catch it blindly. You'll shred the surrounding tissue. You need to pack it with combat gauze and apply direct pressure, or place a junctional tourniquet. Sterling spun around, his eyes wild. I told you to stay in the basement, Jenkins. Get out of my bay. You are a glorified inventory clerk. He's going to die in moments if you don't pack that wound, Morgan stated, holding out the hemostatic gauze. Security, Sterling roared. Get this limping liability out of my ER right now. Two burly security guards grabbed Morgan by the arms. She did not fight them. She simply looked at Sterling, her eyes dead and cold. She let herself be pulled back into the hallway, leaning against the cold cinder block wall. She closed her eyes, listening as the monitor in Bay 1 flatlined moments later. She was useless here, they had made sure of that. But as she opened her eyes, she felt a strange vibration trembling through the concrete floor beneath her boots. It was faint at first, a distant rhythmic thudding. It was not an ambulance. It was not the local news chopper. Morgan knew that sound. It was a sound that had haunted her nightmares and carried her greatest triumphs. It was the heavy twin-engine percussion of military utility helicopters, and they were coming in hot. The vibration in the floor quickly escalated into a bone-rattling tremor. Outside, the torrential rain of the storm was suddenly blown sideways. The civilian life flight pilots scrambled away from the helipad as the night sky was blotted out by massive dark silhouettes. 4 United States Marine Corps UH-1Y Venom helicopters descended like predatory birds upon Pine Ridge Regional. They ignored the small rooftop helipad, which could not bear their weight anyway. Instead, they flared aggressively over the front lawn and the employee parking lot. The immense downwash of the rotors flattened trees, snapped light poles, and crushed the roofs of parked cars. Inside the ER, the chaos of the mass casualty event froze. Doctors, nurses, and bleeding patients alike stared at the shattered front lobby windows as the deafening roar of the turbine engines overpowered the hospital alarms. Before the rotors even slowed, the side doors of the Venom slid open. Heavily armed Marines in full combat gear poured out into the rain. They were not moving like a standard medevac unit. They were moving with tactical precision, establishing a defensive perimeter around the lead chopper. From the lead aircraft, 4 Marines emerged carrying a heavy field litter. On it lay a man tangled in wires, blood-soaked bandages, and complex field stabilization gear. Walking beside the litter, barking orders into a headset, was Major Garrett "Grizzly" Hayes. His uniform was stained with mud and blood. His face was a terrifying portrait of desperate rage. The automatic sliding doors of the ER had jammed due to the power fluctuations. 2 Marines simply drove the butts of their rifles into the glass, shattering the doors entirely, and kicked the frames off their tracks. The wind and rain howled into the pristine lobby, carrying the smell of jet fuel and copper. The Marines charged into the emergency room, boots crunching over broken glass. Dr. Sterling, recovering from his initial shock, puffed up his chest and marched toward the advancing soldiers. "What in God's name do you think you are doing?" Sterling bellowed over the rotor noise. "This is a civilian hospital. You can't just crash through my doors with assault rifles. I am the chief of surgery, and you will—" Major Hayes did not even break stride. He hit Sterling with a stiff forearm, shoving the arrogant doctor hard against the triage desk. "Shut up and listen to me, civilian," Hayes barked. His voice carried the terrifying gravel of a man who had commanded troops in the darkest corners of the earth. "I have a critically wounded Marine on this litter. His chest cavity is compromised. He has a ruptured descending aorta temporarily held by a reboe balloon and a live unexploded 40mm high-explosive round embedded in his left flank." A collective gasp echoed through the ER. Sheila Carmichael backed away in sheer terror. Half the nursing staff dropped what they were holding. Sterling went pale, stammering. "An unexploded bomb? You brought a live explosive into my hospital? You need to leave immediately. Call the bomb squad. I'm not letting my staff anywhere near that." "I don't give a damn about your staff," Hayes growled, stepping closer to Sterling, towering over him. "And I sure as hell am not letting a pampered plastic surgeon wannabe touch my commanding officer. We didn't come here for you." Sterling looked bewildered. "Then why did you practically destroy my hospital?" Hayes keyed his shoulder radio, ignoring the doctor. "Secure the perimeter. Nobody in, nobody out. We hold this ER until she gets here." He turned his glare back to the trembling hospital staff. "We are looking for Angel 6, Hayes demanded, his eyes scanning the room. "Where is she?" Silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The staff exchanged confused glances. "Who?" Sheila managed to squeak out. "We don't have an Angel 6 here. We have a Dr. Angelo in pediatrics." "She isn't a doctor," a deep voice rumbled from behind Hayes. Corporal Miles Miller, a towering Marine holding an IV bag over the wounded officer, stepped forward. "She's a combat medic, 1st Medical Battalion Special Operations Task Force. Call sign Angel 6. We tracked her civilian residency to this exact hospital. Bring her out now, or my commander dies in moments," says. Sterling scoffed nervously, trying to regain a shred of his authority. "Major, I know every nurse in this building. We don't have any special operations medics. We have suburban mothers and fresh nursing school graduates. You have bad intel." "The hell we do," Hayes snapped, pulling a crumpled, blood-stained photograph from his tactical vest. He slammed it onto the triage desk. It was a picture taken in the dirt streets of an unnamed war zone. It showed a younger woman in desert camouflage, her face smeared with soot and blood, holding a pressure dressing to a soldier's neck with one hand while returning fire with a sidearm in the other. Sheila leaned in to look at the photo. Her eyes widened in absolute shock. She looked up, scanning the crowded, terrified hallway. From the very back of the corridor, near the supply elevator, came a sound. Thump, drag, thump, drag. The crowd of doctors and nurses slowly parted. Morgan Jenkins stepped into the light of the main ER lobby. She was no longer slouching. The exhausted lines on her face had vanished, replaced by an expression of cold, terrifying focus. She dropped her clipboard. It clattered loudly against the linoleum. Sterling turned, seeing who was approaching. "Jenkins, get back in the basement. Are you insane? This is a military emergency." Morgan ignored him completely. She walked straight past the trembling chief of surgery, her brace clicking heavily with every step, and stopped 3 feet from Major Hayes. The towering major looked down at the limping, quiet nurse who had been the punchline of Pine Ridge Regional for years. Slowly, respectfully, Major Garrett Hayes snapped to attention and delivered a crisp, razor-sharp salute. Every Marine in the room immediately followed suit. The metallic clatter of rifles shifting as a dozen heavily armed men saluted the limping supply nurse echoed through the silent ER. Morgan looked at the wounded man on the litter, then she looked back at Hayes. "I haven't been called Angel 6 in years, Garrett," Morgan said softly. Her voice carried a weight that made Dr. Sterling shiver. "I know, Morgan," Hayes said, dropping a salute, his eyes pleading. "But Captain Reynolds' time is up. The balloon is failing. The ordnance is stable for now, but no civilian surgeon has the clearance or the hands to do a blind aortic repair with live explosives in the cavity. You're the only one who survived the Helmand operation. You're the only one who knows how to do this." Sterling stepped forward, his face red with indignation. "This is preposterous. Jenkins is a crippled supply clerk. She doesn't have surgical privileges. I will have you all arrested, and I will have her medical license revoked." Morgan finally turned to look at Sterling. The quiet, submissive nurse was gone. In her place stood Angel 6, a woman who had pulled men back from the jaws of death while under heavy mortar fire. "Dr. Sterling," Morgan said, her voice deadly calm, "if you speak to me again, I will have Corporal Miles break your jaw. Now, back away from my table." She turned to the Marines. "Get him into Trauma Bay 1. Prep an open thoracotomy kit. And Garrett, give me your sidearm. If the explosive timer triggers, I'm not letting him burn." Trauma Bay 1 cleared out as if a biological weapon had been detonated inside. The moment the words, "live explosive," left Major Hayes' mouth, Dr. Sterling and the civilian nurses scrambled behind the reinforced blast glass of the observation room. Only Morgan Jenkins, Major Hayes, and Corporal Miles Miller remained inside the bay with the dying commanding officer, Captain Caleb Reynolds. The sliding glass doors locked shut. The only sound in the room was the frantic, erratic beeping of the cardiac monitor and the heavy, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the exterior windows. Morgan stood over the operating table, her eyes scanning Captain Reynolds' pale, sweat-drenched face. She didn't see a hospital room. In her mind, she was back in the sun-baked dust of Helmand Province, where the air tasted like copper and the only thing standing between her men and the grave was the speed of her hands. "Miller, gloves and gowns, now!" Morgan barked. The quiet, submissive tone she had used for years was entirely gone, replaced by the sharp, authoritative crack of a seasoned combat veteran. Corporal Miles Miller, a man built like a freight train, fumbled momentarily with the sterile packaging before ripping it open and helping Morgan scrub in. "Status on the re-BOA?" Morgan asked, looking at the thin catheter tube inserted into Reynolds' femoral artery, which had a balloon inflated inside his aorta to temporarily halt the massive internal bleeding. "Pressure is dropping, Angel 6, Major Hayes said, his eyes locked on the monitor. "The balloon is slipping. The arterial wall is too shredded. We have only moments before it completely fails and he..." bleeds out into his chest cavity. "And the ordnance?" she asked, her eyes moving to the grotesque fist-sized entry wound on Reynolds' left flank. 40mm high-explosive dual-purpose grenade, Hayes replied grimly. Fired from a launcher during the ambush but didn't detonate on impact. It's lodged against his 12th rib, a millimeter from the descending aorta. The EOD team is flying in from Camp Henderson, but they are minutes out. "We don't have minutes," Morgan said. "If that balloon slips, I have to open his chest and cross-clamp the aorta manually, but the vibration of cracking his ribs or applying the clamp might trigger the impact fuse on the grenade." Major Hayes unholstered his standard-issue M18 sidearm, checked the chamber, and placed it on the stainless steel Mayo stand right next to the surgical scalpels. "If it arms," Hayes said softly, "you use this. Don't let him burn alive." That was his only order before he lost consciousness. Morgan stared at the gun for a fraction of a second. She nodded once. "Miller, you are my surgical assist," Morgan ordered. "Major, you monitor the vitals and handle the suction. When I tell you to pull, you pull. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am," the two hardened Marines replied in unison. Behind the blast glass, Dr. Sterling was frantically speaking into a wall phone, likely screaming for the police bomb squad. His face was pale and pressed against the window. He watched in absolute disbelief as the crippled supply nurse he had berated daily picked up a number 10 scalpel with zero hesitation. Suddenly, the cardiac monitor shrieked a continuous high-pitched alarm. "Blood pressure is tanking. 40 over palp," Hayes yelled. "The balloon failed. He's crashing." "Time's up," Morgan said. She pressed the blade into Reynolds' chest, making a massive sweeping incision from the sternum around the left side to the armpit, a classic anterolateral thoracotomy. Blood instantly welled up, thick and dark, spilling onto the floor. Morgan reached for the heavy steel rib spreaders. She inserted the metal blades into the incision. But as she went to crank the handle to force the rib cage open, her bad leg slipped on the pooling blood. Her titanium brace groaned. A searing spike of phantom pain shot up her spine. The exact same pain from the day an IED had vaporized her medical Humvee, shattering her leg and killing 3 of her best friends. For years, Pine Ridge Regional had told her she was broken. They told her she was weak. Morgan gritted her teeth, her eyes flashing with a terrifying primal fury. She reached down and slammed the locking mechanism on her knee brace into the rigid position. Click. "Not today," she whispered. Bracing her locked titanium leg against the base of the operating table for leverage, she gripped the crank of the rib spreader and pulled back with all her upper body strength. Bones snapped and cracked violently as the chest cavity was forced open. "Miller, retractor, pull the lung aside," Morgan commanded. Miller plunged his gloved hands into the chest cavity, pulling the collapsing lung out of the way. "Suction, Garrett." Major Hayes jammed the suction tube into the pooling lake of blood. Through the crimson haze, Morgan saw it. The massive tear in the descending aorta, pumping out a geyser of blood with every weak beat of the dying man's heart. And resting barely an inch below the tear, glistening with blood, was the brass and steel casing of the unexploded 40mm grenade. Her hands, slick with the blood, hovered over the bomb. Her fingers were millimeters from the fuse. A single tremor, a single slip, and the room would be instantly vaporized. Behind the glass, Dr. Sterling actually covered his eyes, unable to watch. Morgan's hands did not shake. They were as steady as carved marble. She slid the heavy vascular clamp past the lethal explosive, her knuckles brushing the cold brass casing of the grenade. She found the artery above the tear. Clack! She locked the clamp. Instantly, the geyser of blood stopped. "Clamp is secure," Morgan breathed, her voice completely flat. "Garrett, push 2 units of O-negative and hit him with a milligram of epinephrine. We need to wake his heart back up." 10 seconds later, the flat line on the monitor stuttered. Then a slow, rhythmic beep returned. Beep, beep, beep. Morgan looked up at Hayes. Sweat was pouring down the major's face, mixing with the dirt and blood of the battlefield. He looked at the nurse, awe radiating from his exhausted eyes. "He's stable," Hayes whispered. "You did it, Angel." Before Morgan could reply, the ER doors blasted open again. 4 men in massive, heavily armored bomb disposal suits stormed into the lobby, flanked by more Marines. The EOD team had arrived. The lead EOD technician, a burly master sergeant whose name tape read Cooper, stepped into the trauma bay. He took one look at the open chest cavity, the clamped aorta, and the live grenade resting precariously against the spinal column. Then he looked at Morgan, noting her steady hands and the locked mechanical brace on her leg. "Damn, Doc," Cooper muttered through his helmet radio. "You left the hardest part for me." "It's wedged tight, Sergeant," Morgan warned, stepping back just an inch to give the man room. The impact warped the casing. If you twist it, the friction might trip the internal detonator. Cooper nodded slowly. He pulled a specialized non-magnetic extraction tool from his kit. All right, everyone who doesn't have a death wish, clear the room. I'm not leaving my patient, Morgan stated flatly. I'm not leaving my CO, Hayes echoed. Miller silently crossed his massive arms, standing his ground. Cooper sighed. Marines, you people are insane. All right, nobody breathe. For the next few agonizing minutes, the trauma bay was dead silent. The only sound was the clicking of Cooper's tools and the steady beep of Reynolds' heart monitor. Morgan watched with unblinking focus as the bomb technician delicately worked the explosive free from the shattered ribs. With a sickening schlick of tearing tissue, the grenade came loose. Cooper caught it smoothly in a Kevlar-lined blast pouch, immediately sealing it and handing it to his number 2, who sprinted out the back exit toward a containment vehicle. Target secured, Cooper exhaled, lifting his visor to wipe the sweat from his eyes. Incredible work holding him together, ma'am. You've got ice in your veins. Thank you, Sergeant, Morgan replied, turning back to the table. Now I need to suture this artery before the tissue necrosis sets in. Miller, give me a 3-0 Prolene stitch. For the next hour, Morgan performed a flawless vascular repair. It was a masterclass in trauma surgery, executed under conditions that would have broken the most decorated civilian surgeons. When she finally tied the last knot and removed the clamp, the blood flowed perfectly. No leaks, no rupture. Captain Reynolds was going to live. By the time Morgan finished closing the chest and dressing the wounds, the storm outside had broken. The harsh fluorescent lights of the ER were suddenly accompanied by the pale, cold light of dawn creeping through the shattered lobby windows. The Marines transferred Reynolds onto a secure transport litter. Morgan stripped off her blood-soaked gown and gloves, tossing them into the biohazard bin. She reached down and unlocked her knee brace with a sharp click. As she walked out into the main ER lobby, the scene was entirely different from the one she had left. The mass casualty event from the ironworks had been stabilized, but the civilian staff was frozen, standing in a wide circle around the lobby. Dr. Elliot Sterling was standing near the triage desk, flanked by the hospital administrator and 2 local police officers. He looked furious, embarrassed, and desperate to regain control of his domain. As Morgan approached, accompanied by Major Hayes and a dozen heavily armed Marines, Sterling puffed out his chest. "Jenkins," Sterling barked, though his voice lacked its usual venom and trembled slightly. "You completely violated hospital protocol. You performed an unauthorized thoracotomy without a medical license. I don't care what military theatricals are happening here. You are fired. I will personally see to it that you face criminal charges for practicing medicine without a license." "Shut your mouth, civilian," Major Hayes interrupted, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. He stepped between Morgan and the doctor. "She is not Jenkins," Hayes said loudly, making sure every doctor, nurse, and administrator in the room heard him. "She is First Lieutenant Morgan Jenkins, United States Navy, formerly the chief trauma medic for the Marine Raider Special Operations Task Force. She holds a Silver Star and a Navy Cross for single-handedly holding off a platoon of insurgents while saving the lives of 12 Marines in a collapsed building after a blast had already shattered her leg." The hospital staff gasped. Sheila Carmichael covered her mouth in shock. Sterling went ghostly pale, his jaw opening and closing like a suffocating fish. I didn't. Her file said she was a supply clerk. Because she was medically discharged and you arrogant fools didn't bother to read past the word disabled, Hayes sneered. He turned to Morgan, his expression softening into absolute reverence. "Angel 6, Hayes said, extending his hand. "Captain Reynolds is being medevaced to the surgical ward at Walter Reed, but my unit is shipping back out to Europe in the coming weeks. We have a vacant slot for a civilian medical consultant. We need you. Your country needs you." Morgan looked at the hospital she had worked in for years. She looked at the supply closet she had been banished to, the cold linoleum she had limped across, and the faces of the people who had treated her like a broken, discarded liability. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her plastic Pine Ridge Regional Hospital ID badge, and tossed it onto the floor at Dr. Sterling's feet. "I'm done with inventory, Garrett," Morgan said, a fierce, triumphant smile breaking across her face for the first time in years. "Let's go home." "Ura," Miles Miller grunted behind her. The Marines formed a protective, honorable diamond formation around her. Together, they walked out of the shattered hospital doors, the heavy mechanical click of Morgan's brace echoing not as a sign of weakness, but as the steady, unstoppable march of a warrior reborn. They boarded the lead Venom helicopter. As the massive twin engines spooled up, roaring to life and flattening the grass, Dr. Sterling and the staff watched through the broken glass. The chopper lifted into the morning sky, banking hard toward the sunrise, leaving the arrogant doctor in the dust of the angel's wake. If Morgan's incredible courage and unstoppable resilience gave you chills, you won't want to miss our next true-to-life medical thriller. Hit that like button, share this gripping story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping tales of unsung heroes who defy the odds. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Morgan's shoes? See you in the next video.